Well, Namaskar, Annyeong Hasamnika. I'm truly delighted to welcome you all from Seoul, Republic of Korea. Hope you and your family are safe and healthy. This is Sonu Trivedi, Director of the Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center, Embassy of India, Seoul, welcoming you all to this 10-day workshop on Facets of Modern India. At the Cultural Center, we have always endeavored to bring the diverse cultural canvas of India at your doorsteps, wherever you are in the world. Keeping up with its mission of promoting the rich cultural heritage of India, today we are before you to bring the glimpses of modern India, India as it stands today, along with its rich civilizational legacy and cultural vibrancy at this truly international forum. For those who are joining us here for the first time, let me briefly introduce the Cultural Center to all. Swami Vivekanand Cultural Center, or Indian Cultural Center as it is popularly known, is the cultural wing of the Embassy of India in Seoul, promoting Indian culture in the Republic of Korea. Fulfilling a long-held desire to provide a platform to showcase India's rich cultural heritage and serve as the nodal point for cultural exchanges between India and Republic of Korea, the center was established on 1st of July 2011. Since its inception, Center has been providing regular classes on yoga, Indian classical and contemporary dances, musical instruments like tabla, harmonium, and languages such as Hindi and Sanskrit. It also organizes special lectures on diverse aspects of Indian culture, politics, and society by involving renowned Indian and Korean scholars and academia. Over the years, Cultural Center has also built an extensive network of partnership with various cultural organizations, city administrations, and provincial governments across the country, intending to broaden the stakeholders and promoting Indian culture in Republic of Korea. Today, it is a matter of great honor for me to host this 10-day workshop on Facets of Modern India. It is a personal pleasure and delight to welcome all the participants, scholars, and students from India, Republic of Korea, and other parts of the world. Let me tell you, we have participants who have registered from Russia, China, Bulgaria, Hungary, Brazil, Vietnam, Nepal, Maldives, Iran, Afghanistan, and several other countries. It is going to be a truly cosmopolitan masterclass by globally renowned experts from India. We have an excellent panel lined up for the next 10 days, all experts in their own domain to discuss about the facets of modern India. Let me also make here some announcements related to the session. For our Korean friends, we have a facility for simultaneous Korean interpretation. Please check this option available at the bottom of your screen. All participants will be muted throughout the lecture. This I have already announced. During Q&A only, you will have the option of unmuting yourself. For asking the questions, you may raise your hands from the participants window. One very important thing that I would like to convey here, that the attendance link for the participants will be shared 10 minutes before the session ends. 10 minutes, that is, after 50 minutes, we will share the attendance link. Certificate of participation will be given to only those who attend all the sessions. And the last thing that I would like to announce here is the session will be logged now. After I finish these announcements, we are going to log the session. If by any chance you are out of the meeting, you can join us through live streaming link on our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages. And my last appeal, we would request you to maintain discipline and decorum during the entire duration of the lecture and also throughout the 10 sessions that we are having here. Without much ado, let us begin with the deliberations, which will be followed by open house discussion and live interaction by the participants. I understand that our chief guest, the inaugural speaker, President of ICCR, Dr. Vinesh Sahasrabudhe has to leave. So we will see if the time permits, we will take the question. I'm extremely pleased to have your blessing, sir, here with us. And thank you for joining us live here today. And we also have with us Her Excellency Shri Priya Ranganathan, Ambassador of India to Republic of Korea. With these words, let me call upon Ambassador Shri Priya Ranganathan for her welcome remarks. Over to you, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Sonu. First of all, I would also like to add my words of welcome to Dr. Sahasrabudhe, the president of the ICCR, who has graciously agreed to give us his time and his knowledge and the benefit of his wisdom and experience as we kick off with this inaugural address today as part of our 10-day long workshop on Facets of Modern India. This workshop, we hope, will help us to give to the people of Korea in particular a more contemporary glimpse into what India is today, what India stands for, what India has always stood for, and what the stage at which we are in today. There is in all the interaction that I've had with the Korean nationals in various walks of life over the past 2 years that I've had the honor of serving here as the ambassador, I have found that there is a certain datedness in the understanding and appreciation of India, and it is this gap that we are hoping that we will begin to fill through this workshop. I know that India is an endlessly complex and endlessly mesmerizing country. It's not something that can really be fully understood in the course of the 10 sessions that we have in mind. But we hope very much that this will allow us to pique your curiosity, those who have not yet had an insight into India, to develop your thoughts, those who are already studying India or have had an exposure to India. And hopefully over the next few years, we will have the opportunity for far more interaction with each and every one of you through the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center and various other events and opportunities that the embassy will have to offer, so that this becomes the beginning of a longer conversation that we have with you. Sir, Dr. Sahasrabuddhe, I cannot thank you enough for agreeing so readily to our request that you should share your thoughts and your insights with us. I'm 100% sure that the audience today will be enriched by by what you will have to say. I wish we could have more time with you. The time that we get is never enough, but we are grateful for whatever time we have. Thank you so much.
We now move over to the inaugural speaker of this workshop, Dr. Avinash Sahasrabudhe ji, who is a member of parliament, Rajya Sabha from Maharashtra since July 2016, and also the president of Indian Council of Cultural Relations. He is also the national vice president of Bharatiya Janata Party. Dr. Sahasrabudhe is a researcher, student of political science and trainer in democracy by profession and a parliamentarian by elevation. He holds the position of honorary director at the Public Policy Research Center, New Delhi. Besides, he is currently also the vice president at Rambhau Malgi Prabodhini, a unique institution which is one of its kind research and training academy for elected representatives and social workers. Dr. Sahasrabudhe is a postgraduate in English literature and PhD in political science, both from University of Mumbai. He has been active in politics and is a regular contributor to several Marathi and English language dailies and weeklies, and a blogger as well. Over the last 2 years, he has been appointed as the court member of University of Delhi, also to Indian Council of World Affairs, as well as a member to the Press Council of India. Let us hear to your inaugural address and views on the idea of India. I welcome you once again and look forward to your lecture, sir. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Sonu Trivedi ji. Her Excellency Supriya Ranganathan ji, India's ambassador to the beautiful country of Korea at Seoul, and Sonu Trivedi ji, our very active director of the Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center at Seoul, other dignitaries present, and more importantly, all those participants who have taken out time to understand as to what exactly are the facets of modern India, and with that quest in their mind have joined this very unique 10-day workshop, all brothers and sisters. It's a pleasure and privilege to be here delivering this inaugural lecture on the idea of India. And Madam Supriya Ranganathan was very right in pointing out that India is an endlessly complex country and also very mesmerizing one. But that also makes the entire process of understanding India in a way very difficult, because small countries, tiny countries, or countries that have emerged only during last couple of centuries maybe, you can understand those countries, their history, their culture, their civilizational moorings as well, their society by visiting their websites or maybe reading a couple of books on them. But India is so complex that to understand India, I would suggest that one has to visit India. Because India is an experience. Those who have experienced India, I would say, have properly understood what exactly is the idea of India. And therefore, at the outset, let me extend an invitation to all those who are participating in this workshop to take out time and visit this country, which will definitely add to your insight, add to your understanding, not only of this country, but perhaps the entire South Asia and perhaps the entire Asian culture as well. Because in a way, as what was very rightly pointed out by many, that India occupies a position in a way which connects the West Asia and the East Asia. So India is in the middle, and therefore to understand the Asian cultures, understanding India is extremely critical. Having said that, if I have now to reflect upon the idea of India, I would suggest that there are at least 5 significant aspects of what we call as the idea of India. And these aspects are intertwined with India's civilizational history. They are an inseparable part of India's rich heritage. And therefore, India, as I understand, is extremely popular as a country and also as people in, I would say, almost all parts of the globe. I haven't come across a country or a section of the global community, those who hate India. World over, India has been loved by the people. And one of the reasons why people love India is that there is a huge amount of curiosity about India. Now, this curiosity and love for India requires to be translated into a deeper understanding of India. And therefore, for that deeper understanding, joining this kind of a workshop is extremely important. Maybe I would suggest that this is the first step to, in a way, satisfy your quest for understanding the largest democracy of the world. And therefore, once again, I welcome you. Now, when we talk about the idea of India, and as I said, there are at least 5 important aspects of the idea of India. It starts with the democratic traditions in India. Remember, India is the largest democracy, but it is not the newest democracy. I mean, formally, India was made or converted into a parliamentary democracy kind of a setup only in 1950 when we adopted our constitution. So constitutionally speaking, in the recent history, yes, of course, India's democratic traditions were formalized in 1950 and there onwards. And it has been 70 years that we have been leaving these traditions of democratic governance. But let me tell you very humbly that India's democracy is something which is a part of its blood. Democratic traditions in India are millennia old. In fact, you cannot separate the idea of democracy from the idea of India. I am saying so because the Indian democratic traditions start with our spiritual democracy. India is essentially a spiritual democracy. Unlike several parts of the globe, India never said that a particular way is the only way to reach and to evolve a bridge towards the Almighty. India has always said, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. It means that the truth is one. The supreme truth is one. One may call it the divine element, one may name it as God, or whatever one desires to, but that is one and inseparable. But yes, wise men describe it differently. And therefore, Ekam Sat Vipra Bahuda Vadanti. And therefore, we never allowed any particular way of worship to be hegemonic, much less to be monopolistic. And therefore, that is the fundamental idea of spiritual democracy. In a way, India's spiritual democratic traditions are the guarantee of the pluralism that India has been living all through the centuries. And therefore, for a sustainable pluralism, this kind of spiritual democracy is a must. And India is the living example of continuing with these spiritual democratic traditions, as I said, for several thousand years. And now, post-independence, after the constitution was formulated, our journey is towards, as what Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who had played a key role in drafting the Constitution of India, has envisioned that we have to march towards achieving social and economic democracies as well. So, India's democratic traditions have traveled from spiritual democracy through political democracy, and now we are aiming at economic and social democracies. This is the journey of democratic traditions in India. It is not that our constitution and our bicameral parliamentary system is modeled on a particular country or is some kind of a idea borrowed from somewhere. Well, formally and technically speaking, it might be so, but the democratic traditions are our original traditions because we owe them to our spiritual democracy. And therefore, I believe that when we understand India, when we try to get to have a deeper knowledge and understanding about India, the first thing that everybody needs to understand is India's rich democratic traditions and India's journey over several centuries from spiritual democracy through political democracy to social and economic democracy. Now, people will say that India also had seen several monarchies and kingdoms. So was it democracy? I would humbly put it that even though kings were there, they were also adhering to the democratic traditions. You will find that even in the Ramayana, there are references that when Dasharath or Ram had to take certain decisions, it was a consultative process, and based on consensus only, they decided to move ahead. And therefore, even though there were monarchies and kings, the democratic traditions were alive even under monarchy and various kingdoms. The second important aspect of India, or the idea of India, is the diversity that is very evident in every part of India. Now, this diversity, many a times people describe that it's a killing diversity because such a diverse nation is this. There are more than 22 languages, 22 officially recognized languages, but otherwise there are various small language groups, and if we calculate them, maybe 50 languages are spoken and written in India. And in every other district, if not even a smaller segment of the map of India, you come across a different style, a different lifestyle also, a different linguistic style also. Language may be the same, but the pronunciations differ. The vocabulary also has a slight difference. And we have lived up with this diversity because this diversity, whether it is in our apparels, or it is in the fashions, or it is in our textiles, or maybe it is in our culinary and cuisines, or maybe the way we celebrate various festivals, the way we name various festivals. For example, there are similar kinds of festivals, but then they have different names in different provinces. Doesn't matter. But this entire diversity, if one has to understand, the first and foremost thing to be appreciated is that this diversity is the diverse manifestations of the innate unity of India. It is very commonly said that unity in diversity. But the converse is perhaps more true, diversity in unity. We are unified. We are an integrated country, an integrated society. And what diversity that you observe are only the diverse manifestations of this oneness, which binds us together. I'll give you one example. In India, in several languages, you will come across sayings and proverbs of similar meanings, similar messages. Now, these sayings and these proverbs are common not because of any government order issued from, say, Delhi. They have evolved in those languages because the way of thinking is similar, approach is similar, philosophical viewpoint is similar, and therefore it is unity in diversity and as well diversity in unity. And therefore India's diversity should not be bothering you, should not be bothering anybody for that matter, and one has to deeply be conscious of the element of unity, which, or it's a thread of unity which runs through all these diverse manifestations, whether it is the languages, whether it is the songs and dances, or anything and everything which are a part of our regional cultures as well. And therefore, let us not get unnecessarily confused by the diversity that India has. This diversity is, in a way, strengthens our unity, because our unity is at the core, and this diversity are the just diverse or different manifestations of this thread of unity. So this is the second aspect of the idea of India. The third aspect of the idea of India is the principle of Antyodaya. Antyodaya is a Sanskrit word. It means anybody who is the most deprived is the most deserved. When you talk about benefits of government schemes or fruits of development or any kind of these things which under the idea of welfare state, one has to ensure that they need to be taken to the last man. This last man, the idea of the last man is the person who is the most deprived. And therefore, this is the idea of India's social justice in a way, that those who are the most deprived are perhaps the most deserved for the benefits, for the welfare schemes, or for that matter, any other programs which are for the welfare of the people at large. And therefore, this is the idea of Antyodaya. It was very elaborately discussed in the literature of Mahatma Gandhi and also Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay. And this idea of Antyodaya, as I understand, is applicable in every sector, every field, every walk of life. Even if we talk about education. Now, those who do not make it to the higher grades, those who do not pass examinations, in the idea of Antyodaya, they deserve the most when it comes to attending the needs of the students. Because they are the most deprived in a way. Maybe they are not in a position to have that access to knowledge and understanding because of certain limitations. And therefore, we need to pay attention to them more. The weakest, perhaps the poorest, requires the most attention. And that is the idea of Antyodaya. And as I said, it is applicable in every walk of life, whether it is governance, whether it is education, whether it is any kind of development. For example, recently, during the last 4 years, the government has come out with an idea of aspirational districts. Now, what is aspirational district? Every district is aspirational. But earlier, it was considered that those districts which are least developed in all development parameters, who are at the rock bottom, they were called as the most backward districts. Now, all these districts, close to 136 districts all over India, and India, those who may not be aware, has more than 700 districts. And therefore, all these 135 districts, which are considered as the most backward districts, are given the top priority when it comes to development. And therefore, they have been named as aspirational districts. All fruits of development, the government ensures, reach these districts first. They are given the preference, they are given priority. And that is the idea of India, which I believe is the quintessential concept of social justice in practical terms as envisioned in India, and which is, I believe, a part of the idea of India, an essential part, an essential aspect of the idea of India. The other two, one is our idea of relating with Mother Nature. See, world over, even the United Nations, earlier, which were considered as human development goals, now are sustainable development goals. So this idea of sustainability, it's something very common, everybody is concerned. And sustainability could really be translated into reality if we have a proper perspective of viewing the relationship of human beings with Mother Nature. Many a times in several articles, several books, several reports, we come across instances wherein we are left with the impression that as if human beings are in competition with Mother Nature. We are out there to conquer over nature. No, the idea of India rejects this idea of confrontation. The idea of India says that nature and human beings are interdependent. And we have to move forward hand in hand. And therefore we call it Mother Nature. That is the idea. In fact, in India, many people are still practicing when they get up in the morning, they first of all pray to Mother Earth and seek her forgiveness, saying, Padasparsham kshamasvame. I am going to put my feet on you. Hey, Mother Nature, please forgive me. That is the idea. Because the idea of India has sent this particular concept at its core, that we are not in competition with Mother Nature. We, in fact, are, we have to collaborate. We have to work in tandem with Mother Nature, and we have to take care of Mother Nature as well. And therefore, we never say that we have to exploit natural resources. We have to use them as per our needs. But Mother Nature is supreme. Mother Nature is our mother, and our existence also depends upon the way we define our relationship with nature. And therefore, we totally reject the idea of any confrontation. We want a collaboration with Mother Nature. And that is the another, which is the fourth aspect, fourth important dimension of idea of India. This is something unique, I would say. Lastly, the centrality of our philosophy of world as family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Now, why do we say so? Because, as I understand, world over, we find that there are certain societies which are extremely individualistic. They consider that individual is supreme, and collectivism or his societal relationship, it's something which is secondary. And there are other societies that consider that collectivism is supreme, society is supreme, individual is nothing. So there are imbalances naturally. If I have to give an example, there are societies which consider that individual is supreme, they consider that the relationship between an individual and the society is that of a grain of groundnut with the jute bag in which the groundnuts are stored, kind of. If the jute bag gets damaged, then all the groundnuts will come out. They will go here and there, helter-skelter, because they don't have any organic relationship with the society, which here is symbolized by the jute bag. And there are other societies which consider that the relationship between an individual and his society is that of a particle of sugar and milk. The milk has to be sweetened, and therefore individual has no existence at all. An individual will have to kind of forget his identity. It will get diluted. The sweetness of the milk is something which is supreme. Individual has no meaning, no existence, no identity. Whereas the Indian model tells us, the Indian idea of relationship tells us that an individual is related to the society in a similar fashion, the way a particular part of our body is related with the entire body. Whether it is our fingers, whether it is our hand, whether it is our eyes or ears or nose or whatever it is. This relationship is organic. They are independent. They have a particular design. They have a particular objective. They have a particular functionality. But all our body parts are essentially integrated with the entire body. And that kind of definition of relationship between an individual and society provides us a unique view to look at the entire world as a family. And therefore we consider world as a family. In these days of pandemic, when everybody was feeling isolated, ignored, or maybe alone, I think the Indian philosophy provides that much needed solace, that no, nobody is alone. Nobody is in a fragmented society. We are all united, and therefore world is a family. Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. That is the fundamental feature of the idea of India. So these are the 5 things, if I may recount them. It starts with the idea of spiritual democracy, then unity in diversity as well as diversity in unity, Antyodaya, which is ensuring that the deprived is given the first priority. He is considered as the most deserved, the most deprived as the most deserved and the most preferred for social justice, economic justice. Thirdly, the element of harmony of human life with Mother Nature. And fifthly, basically, the idea of world as one single family, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I think if we understand all these facets of the idea of India, to understand the idea of India would not be a thing which is difficult. But once again, before I close, I would suggest that those who want really to understand what India is, they need to visit India. Because India is a country, as the famous journalist has described, it's a land where there are no full stops. And therefore, India is a journey. It's a continuous civilizational journey. We call it Nitya Nutan Chirapuratan. Every time it renews itself, and at the same time, it is perhaps the most ancient of the civilizations. And therefore, this kind of interplay between modernity and being ancient, it's something which is at the core of the idea of India, which you require to experience. And I would once again say that joining this kind of a workshop is the first step. And the essential part in this journey is to visit India and experience what India is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom. And in fact, the 5 principles of the idea of India, 5 aspects that you have focused are truly very significant, and I'm sure our young friends who have joined from Korea as well as India and other parts of the world would be truly enriched by your thought-provoking lecture and the principles that you have pointed out, the democratic tradition and the spiritual democracy that we have in India, and how we have evolved from political democracy to economic democracy, and the diversity of traditions, principle of Antodaya, idea of relating to Mother Nature and Vasudev Kutumbakam. And finally, you very well summarized Nitya Nutan Chir Puratan. So wonderful words. With this, I would like to thank you on behalf of Swami Vivekananda Cultural Center and Embassy of India for your lecture. Meanwhile, we have a long list of participants, and I'm sure they will have some questions. We wanted them to interact with you. So may I request the participants to please raise your hand? I saw one of the hands that was raised. Meanwhile, the participants, they are preparing their question. May I request any of our team members, or maybe our ambassador, Shri Priya Ranganathan ma'am, if you have a question, or any of the our embassy officials. Meanwhile, our participants, they are preparing their questions.
I will very quickly come in on this, Sonu, taking advantage of the opportunity you are given. Sir, I think that was a fascinating overview, and there are so many strands that you have pulled together to give even us Indians a more, how should I say, comprehensive understanding or a comprehensive appreciation when we are asked, what do you think of when you think India? There are so many things that thoughts that spring into our mind, and I think what you have really pulled together for us are some of the aspects that are really at the core. Now, the only observation that I have, because I think there is a very clear understanding and appreciation of India as a democratic, diverse, secular, progressive country. But the aspect of India being an environmentally, country where sustainability and environment consciousness is high, has become a little less vivid, shall I say. I mean, we know how, when the way we have grown up, there has always been a whole sense of how whatever we do, all our practices, all our rituals have a strong connection with nature. Going from the practice in South India of drawing rangolis made with rice flour, and that is done because of the concept that you have to also enable the birds and the ants and the insects to have something along with you. You give them water and you give them this. So this concept of environment sustainability is very ingrained in everything that we do. But modern day India, unfortunately, does not reflect that. I mean, the kind of for want of a better word, I would say the kind of carelessness with which our urban centers have grown. I think that has really shown how, in many ways, we have lost the path. So, what really are we trying to do to rekindle these old concepts and principles that are so dear to us, but at the same time are somewhat dusted over, shall I say, for, at least for the current generation?
Well, I think this is a very pertinent question, because if we look at all the ancient civilizations or ancient traditions, not only in India, but world over, I think the element of modernity, it's so seductive, so attractive, that unfortunately the trend that goes is to sever with your past, and which is, I believe, detrimental to our development, because as it is said, our journey is always, whether one talks about India or any other country, the journey of human civilization has always been from the past through the present to the future. And if we delink ourselves from our past, from our traditions, maybe, of course, everything that is old need not be considered as gold. That is true. But it doesn't mean that everything that is old is obsolete. There are some elements which are kind of carrying some eternal values, eternal importance. And therefore, we need to be having that Nira Kshira Viveka, as what they say, that what is to be carried forward and what is perhaps to be considered as obsolete. There lies your viveka, or your ability to think what is right, what is righteous, and what is wrong, and what is perhaps outdated. And in that sense, I believe if we revisit our traditional Indian knowledges, our all other aspects of our traditions, I think that would be very, very enlightening. You have very rightly pointed out as to how the practice of Rangoli has evolved. Now, there is a very powerful message in that. I mean, Rangoli is one thing, but there are even today many communities, many houses, many families who first of all keep a part of the food that they prepare in their house, maybe in the backyard if they have anything, or even at the front door, simply to take care of, as what you said, those who might be hungry, and there could be insects or birds or whosoever. And therefore, this consideration of the other, of the deprived, of the one who is perhaps marginalized, who is at the periphery, that is something very central to our idea. I mean, even our temples, for example, they were, and you come from South India and you are more perhaps aware of these things, that these temples had the tradition of Annadan, food distribution. That was an essential part of our temple culture. But unfortunately, the bug of modernity has bitten us in such a way that we decided to sever our links, which I believe is detriment.
Thank you, sir. We have a question from one of our Korean friends, Lee Han Sol. And the question is that he wants you to speak a bit more about spiritual democracy. And he says that maybe we are not, the Koreans are not aware about this concept of spiritual democracy. So please, if you could elaborate a bit more on it.
Well, what many people would say secularism, I would describe it as spiritual democracy. Because in secularism, there is some kind of a distancing from your and religion, which is not required. If you consider all religions as equal, and if you consider that every other religious path is equally valid and equally powerful and equally respectable, which is Sarva Dharma Samabhava, as what we say, then it is spiritual democracy, because you are not discriminating between any religion. There is no kind of hegemony. There is no kind of monopoly, cannot be. When we have in Indian traditions, maybe crores of deities are there, as they say, and you will find all kind of variety there. And the 5 elements, basic elements, Pancha Mahabhuta as what we call, all are represented in all our deities. Our festivities are also devoted to a particular deity because it's a celebration of that particular element of nature, maybe. And therefore, if we take all these things into consideration, I think that is only the other name of what I say, spiritual democracy. When in an economic democracy or in a political democracy, every single individual is equally important because he or she is a voter. Likewise, in spiritual democracy, every other way of worship is equally important, and it is equally valid, and it is equally recognized also. So that is how we look at it, and therefore the term I used is spiritual democracy. There is hardly anything difficult or complex to understand about.
Thank you, sir. Sir, if you permit, there are some hands raised by participants. Yeah. Can we take some questions?
Yeah, I have some 5 minutes at my disposal.
Okay, quickly, Deepanjali Mishra, are you here? Please quickly unmute and please speak.
A very warm good morning to all of you. Respected Sahasra Buddhe sir, respected Supriya ma'am, and respected Sonu ma'am. The talk is highly resourceful, and I would like to add one thing regarding the environment and culture, environment, sustainability and culture. I come from Odisha, and in Odisha we celebrate a festival which is known as Raja. Here it is the nature is completely worshipped. In fact, we don't allow young girls to walk because the pressure would be put on Mother Earth. Similarly, we don't plow fields during that time because of the pressure which might happen to Mother Earth. So this is what sustainability and environment is all about. Thank you so much.
Thanks for tallying your notes. Thank you.
Mukesh Bhagat.
Sir, how our philosophy and way of life reflect our foreign policy?
Well, in our foreign policy also, we have always been talking about world is a family. This is not something which is a governmental policy. It is the civilizational point of view to look at the world. This is our civilizational perspective. Now, to give you an example, India is perhaps one of those very few countries who were never known as aggressor countries. Give me a single example where India has tried to conquer a particular geographical region. Never. Yes, there is an Indian influence which is very pronounced in several parts of the globe. But that is because of the power of our culture, because of the strength of our culture. It is not because somebody went over there and tried to conquer. Even in Ramayana, when Rama had been to Sri Lanka, he didn't establish Ramarajya there. I mean, it was not a part of his domain, his kingdom. He allowed Vibhishana to take reins of the kingdom which was earlier ruled by Ravana. So we were never a country of aggressors, and that is what is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. Or even in modern day international relations, we were always talking about non-alignment. Because we never view the world in blocks between two superpowers, some kind of a division made. No, we never consider that. And that is how we have been setting our philosophical approach in our foreign policy as well.
Suyash Kumar Jha and Pinku Jha, please.
Great lecture, sir. Sir, India has been as much a country of philosophers as much of warriors. A civilization has to not only thrive, but in order to thrive, it has to also protect itself. Even right now, we are in middle of some kind of conflict. We have an idea of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. I want to ask, how do we reconcile this idea with the challenge of protecting our interests and protecting the very idea that our civilization propounds? Because in order for these ideas to exist, we have to be able to secure our interests.
Very important question. When we say Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, it is also a democracy of aspirations. Like in family, whether the child is 2-year-old or whether there is a grandfather who is maybe 80-year-old. Both are members of the family and both have some kind of role to be played. There is a respect and there is a recognition to everybody. And therefore, for example, the grandfather is expected to support and kind of mentor the grandchild. Likewise, in a when we consider that world is a family, we consider that the principle of live and let live will be made applicable in international relations as well. And therefore, we do not recognize any hegemonic or monopolistic element even in these international relations. And we have a right to be defending our borders, to be protected, and to be continuing on the path of our progress. If every other nation also recognizes that, then the Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam idea could be translated into reality. But that doesn't mean that we should not do that. We should be leading this journey of taking the entire humanity towards the ideal of world as a family. Thank you very much. Sonuji, if you kindly allow me to take your leave.